Number 2. 185,000 soldiers was defeated by an angel. The Word of God speaks of God's intervention in the issues of his people. The story of Hezekiah and his numerous enemies is one of the most outstanding examples of such. Hezekiah was a man who was the polar opposite of his terrible father, Ahaz. During his reign, he received the uncommon honor of doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his forefather David had done. Hezekiah was one of the few knights who abolished the high places of worship. He also cut down the idolatrous Assyrian poles. Furthermore, he destroyed the bronze snake Moses created centuries before, known as Nehushtan, which means a bronze thing. What a pity that this object God used to deliver his people had become a source of worship. For these and other reasons, Hezekiah was regarded as a king who stood apart from and above the other kings of Judah in his adherence to God's commands. After reading about the unfaithfulness and heinous actions of so many of Israel's and Judah's kings, King Hezekiah is a breath of fresh air. He prospered wherever he went because the Lord was with him. 2 Kings 18 verses 13 to 16, New American Standard Bible. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib king of Assyria marched against all of the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent messages to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will endure." So the king of Assyria imposed on Hezekiah, king of Judah, the payment of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah then gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and he gave it to the king of Assyria. Sennacherib, the successor to Shalmaneser, the conqueror of Israel, was the Assyrian king Hezekiah would face. Sennacherib attacked and conquered all of Judah's fortified cities, leaving only Jerusalem. And at that point, Hezekiah may have concluded that he had grossly miscalculated the situation. The demand was enormous. However, things were about to get worse. God would circle the Assyrians around Jerusalem to test Hezekiah's faith and demonstrate his mighty power to his people. Sennacherib either didn't think Hezekiah's ransom was enough, or he was looking for a reason to attack Jerusalem and complete his conquest of Judah anyway, because the Assyrian king sent a delegation and a massive army to Jerusalem to demand the city surrender. They wanted to deliver this to the king in person. Sennacherib's royal spokesman made what he thought was a factly case for Hezekiah and his people to open their gates and surrender. After all, their northern neighbors had fallen to Assyria, and those same cruel conquerors were now at their gates. Infuriated by this encounter, Hezekiah's men returned to the king, their clothes torn in distress. When King Hezekiah heard their report, he did the same thing his men did. He tore his clothes in grief. He had to wonder how such a terrible turn of events had occurred. After all, he had been obedient to God. He had renewed Judah's worship. He had followed the Lord's instructions. He had previously prospered as a result of God's providence, but God was deafeningly silent at the time. King Hezekiah went into the Lord's temple to worship despite his distress. Furthermore, he did something that many of his predecessors did not. He sent a delegation dressed in sackcloth to seek a word from the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. They explained to the God's prophet Judah's dire situation, and they informed him that the Assyrian leader had come back to mock the living God. Isaiah already knew all of this because God knew all of this. As a result, he gave the servants a message for Hezekiah that began with the command, "Don't be afraid." This command frequently appears in the Bible. It's God's way of calming his people, instilling confidence in them, and assuring them that I have everything under control. You can rely on me. The Lord had not only heard the blasphemous words of the Assyrian king's lackey, but he also planned to respond to them. Instead of defeating Jerusalem, King Sennacherib would return to his own land and die by the sword. Then something changed. Sennacherib's royal spokesman was most likely camped at Jerusalem's walls waiting for an answer from Hezekiah when word came that the king had pulled his army out of Lachish and was fighting at Libnah, which was 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Sennacherib had heard that King Tirhakah of Cush was preparing to fight him, which caused the Assyrian king to divert his attention away from Jerusalem for what he thought was only a short time. Sennacherib made certain that Hezekiah knew he would return by repeating the threats made by his underling earlier. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent messengers to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will endure." So the king of Assyria imposed on Hezekiah, king of Judah, the payment of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah then gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At the time, Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and he gave it to the king of Assyria. Then the king of Assyria sent Tartan, Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. So they went up and came to Jerusalem, and when they went up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the road of the fuller's field. Then they called to the king, and Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the household, Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph the secretary went out to them. And Rabshakeh said to them, "Say now to Hezekiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. What is this confidence that you have? You say, but they are only empty words. I have a plan and strength for the war. Now on whom have you relied, that you have revolted against me? Now behold, you have relied on the support of this broken reed on Egypt, on which if a man leans it will go into his hand and pierce it. That is how Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is to all who rely on him. However, if you say to me, we have trusted in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has removed, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now then, come make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able on your part to put riders on them. How then can you drive back even one official of the least of my master's servants and rely on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this man and destroy it. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joah, said to Rabshakeh, speak now to your servants in Aramaic, because we understand it, and do not speak with us in Judean so that the people who are on the wall hear you. But Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me only to your master and to you to speak these words? Has he not also sent me to the men who sit on the wall, doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? Then Rabshakeh stood up and shouted with a loud voice in Judean, saying, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. 2 Kings 18 verses 14 to 28. God heard Hezekiah and reacted to him once more through Isaiah. Sennacherib is mocked in this poetic response which praises God's sovereign rule over the nations. The Assyrian king had not only mocked Judah and her king, he had also mocked and blasphemed the Holy One of Israel. While Sennacherib arrogantly assumed his leadership and might have cut a swath through many nations, he had no idea that God had predetermined his victories as part of his plan. The Assyrian king was then just a pawn on God's kingdom chessboard. Sennacherib couldn't make a move or have a private thought that God wasn't aware of, including any rage he directed at the Lord. On the other hand, Sennacherib would discover how insignificant he was when God inserted his hook into his nose and dragged him back to Assyria. God spoke words of comfort to a king and his people facing an unavoidable siege and starvation. For fear of the Assyrians, the people of Jerusalem had been unable to go outside the walls to plant crops. But God's sign to Hezekiah was that the people of Jerusalem would eat harvests from seed that grew on its own for the next 2 years. They could sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit in the 3rd year. Judah would not be destroyed. A remnant would survive, bear fruit, and leave the walls of Jerusalem because the Lord is zealous for his glory and his covenant people. God would defend Jerusalem against Sennacherib. He said he would do it for my sake and my servant David's sake. God would not let some inexperienced Assyrian king derail his plans. He would also keep his promise to David to keep one of his descendants on the throne of Jerusalem forever. A promise that would eventually culminate in the kingship of Jesus Christ our Lord. Then it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went forth and struck down 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. When the survivors got up early in the morning, behold, all 185,000 of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, left and returned home, and lived at Nineveh. It came about as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with a sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon his son became king in his place. It only took one strike from the Lord's angel to rid Hezekiah of his foe. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were slain in an instant. Sennacherib was suddenly forced to return home without his army. Later, while worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his own sons murdered him. Like the Philistine Goliath, the Assyrian king had mocked the Lord for failing to protect Jerusalem. But in the end, Sennacherib's God could not save his devoted disciple, even in his own temple. This story is a good reminder that faithfulness to God does not protect you from adversity. It does, however, prepare you for those trials. You will be better prepared to deal with trouble and suffering if you live your life from a divine perspective, to rely on Him in bad times as much as you have in good. You will also have the opportunity to witness God at work. However, some people failed the battle of their lives. To watch the story of Cain, click here.